Welcome to this video. We're going to take a deeper look into the pew poll regarding what Catholics actually believe in. And I think most people are familiar with the pew poll regarding the question about the real presence, and that only 50% of those who purport to be Catholics believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. There's also many other topics that we will look at regarding the statistics. So I'd like to first start off with the pew poll. The most famous question is regarding the real presence. And this is a slide that breaks up the questions and the responses into two different pie charts. On the left, we have those who really believe in the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. And on the right, we have those who believe that it is just a symbol. So the interesting aspect of what we see on the left is that 60% of those who believe in the real presence in the Eucharist attend Mass either weekly or more often than weekly. And on the right, those who believe that the Eucharist is merely a symbol, there's only 16% of those respondents that attend Mass on a weekly basis or more frequently. Now, one could draw the conclusion, and I've heard it stated previously, that those who attend Mass more frequently are likely to believe in the Eucharist. But that's not necessarily true. So I would say that the Eucharist, the belief in the Eucharist, the real presence of the Eucharist, is not necessarily because they attend Mass more frequently, but it could also be the opposite, that they attend Mass more frequently because they actually believe in the real presence. So it's not a simple cause and effect here. And I think it could be overly simplified by saying that if you attend Mass more frequently, if we can only get them to come to Mass more, then they'll believe in the real presence. Well, actually, I took a look at that number, and out of those who attend Mass, and it's a different perspective than what these pie charts present. So I calculated the number, and out of those who actually attend Mass weekly or more than weekly, 40%, a little under 40%, so let's say approximately 40% do not believe in the real presence, but yet they attend weekly. Now that's better than a number of 50%. And actually, I think the number is a little over 50%, 51% or 52, 53, something like that, where of all respondents saying that they're Catholic, 53% say that they do not believe in the real presence. But still, you have people who attend Mass weekly and more than weekly, and 40% don't believe in the real presence. That's a bit of a problem. And I think the big problem is catechesis. They just don't know the teaching of the Church. Now, I heard other arguments that blamed the Mass and the way the Mass is conducted, and sometimes in irreverent manner towards the Eucharist, and that there's arguments that the traditional Mass was more reverent, and that may be true. And actually, I believe it is a bit more reverent than the current structure of the Mass. But I would say that the biggest problem is understanding what the teaching of the Catholic Church is. And I can't remember the last time where someone spoke about the Eucharist from the pulpit. It's something that could easily be fixed Now, I'm going to go into some of the beliefs in these surveys that are less well known. And I'm going to give you some responses, the percent of those responding to the questions out of those surveys. And again, these are from Catholics. So let's start with contraception. We're going to start with contraception. It's a very controversial one. So those who approve of contraception, in other words, they practice contraception or approve the practice of it, 89% approve contraception. Those who have an anti-life position, 51%. Those who approve alternative marriages, 67%. And here's an interesting one here. Fertility rate, 2.3%. So for a couple, Catholic couple, they will produce 2.3 children. And with the amount of problems we have currently, and I think one of the stats going around is that every 1 out of 34 births are children who are autistic or on the spectrum. That is not even keeping the population of Catholics alive. It's not a viable percent of people to be providing from each couple. So I'm going to give you another look at this, and I'm going to bring up another chart. This is a chart that differentiates those who go to the new Mass versus those who go to the traditional Mass. And they ask the same questions. So this is what this looks like. And it's a stark contrast between the two. So the first column is the traditional Latin Mass and the percent of respondents. And then you'll see the samples, which is roughly 1,700. In the Pew poll was roughly 1,800. And then where it says that NOM, that's the Novus Ordo Mass, the new Mass, and also where that data was obtained. Very interesting. So approving contraception, again, out of the Catholic respondents, those who attend the new Mass, 89%. But when you go to those who attend the traditional Mass, only 2% approve of contraception. I'm going to go from right to left because that's how we started, by talking about those who responded who attend the new Mass. Those who are anti-life or take anti-life positions, 51% in the new Mass, only 1% in the traditional Mass. Those who say they're Catholic and attend the new Mass, 22%. Mass attendance for traditional Mass goers, 99%. And this is weekly Mass or better. Those who approve alternative marriages, new Mass, 67%. Traditional Mass, 2%. And here's one I didn't mention. Income percent donated. 1.2% of income is donated by those who attend the new Mass, and 6% by those who attend the traditional Mass. And another one that I didn't mention, annual confession and weekly Mass. The new Mass, 25%. traditional Mass attendees, 98%. And I kind of question why they would have only annual confession, but that's what the question was. And if it was more frequent, we'd have less on the new Mass. There's only 25% in the new Mass and 98% on the traditional Mass. If the question was, do you attend confession maybe 4 times a year, at least, or 6 times a year, in other words, every other month, I would suspect that that number would be close, for the new Mass, would be close to half of what you see there. Fertility rate. So I mentioned that it was 2.3 children for couples attending the new Mass, 3.6 children for those attending the traditional Mass, which makes sense when you see the question regarding approval of contraception, and only 2% of those attending the traditional Mass approve of that. And I can attest to that, being at traditional Masses where I see many young, large families and youth in general. So it's a striking contrast. And again, for people who are not familiar with the traditional Mass, this is a traditional Catholic Mass that was around prior to the problem, and still is around, but it was the norm, the normative Mass prior to 1970, when the new Mass was promulgated. In looking at this, I was aware of the stats regarding the Eucharist. Also, I was aware of political polls that polled Catholics regarding who they were voting for. And I noticed that 50% of Catholics, roughly, would vote for the anti-life candidate. It didn't seem to be any different than those who claim not to be Catholic. And it was one of the reasons why I actually started going to the traditional Mass, because I started looking around. I remember being in Mass, and I looked around and I thought, these people that are sitting near me, they don't believe in life. They're not pro-life. Half of them don't believe in the real presence. And I was thinking, they just don't have the same faith as me. And also, in the Mass, there was some activities that I thought were irreverent regarding the Eucharist. And I started looking for something different. So I started, and I was aware of traditional Mass. I went to it before, but not every week. So I started looking at the traditional Mass as a Mass that I would go to every week, which I started doing. One could come to a conclusion looking at these numbers that because you go to a traditional Mass, you're going to have these beliefs because the traditional Mass is so much better. And I think what is really happening here in these numbers is you're getting people who are going to the traditional Mass because they're looking for a uniformity, or let's say a communion of faith. They're looking to attend Mass with people who believe the same thing. That's why you have this big disparity in what actually people believe going from the new Mass as compared to the traditional Mass. I don't think it's so much that the traditional Mass is creating these beliefs in itself, although I do think it's more reverent, and that's one of the reasons why I attend a traditional Mass. Now, I hate to bring this subject up, but I promised to do so. I promised to look into the stats, and I saw this comparison that was provided, and I thought this is really going to be great to get into. It's very, very interesting. But my reluctance in talking about this is that every time I do, I get these comments from people that say, I would really love to go to the traditional Mass, but there's just none around me. And I feel really sorry for them. I feel bad because they can't attend the Mass that they would like to, and that they have a right to attend. And I want to make that clear. This traditional Mass is a Mass that has been around for 1,500 years, and it's a great treasure of the Church and should be available to everyone. I think you can still maintain your faith within the Novus Ordo Mass. It's a valid Mass, and hopefully it will remain that way. I'm going to take also the position that there's arguments within the Catholic community that the new Mass actually does not sponsor belief in the Eucharist because of a number of things, because of the lack of reverent genuflections during the Mass, not enough of them, also the handling of the Eucharist, also the body posture, the orientation of the priest to the people with his back to the tabernacle. And there may be a case in point there, but as I said before, the new Mass is a valid Mass, and you can obtain all the holiness that's available through the Church via the new Mass. But there is a lack of reverence that I've seen, and it's one of the reasons I mentioned that I moved to the traditional Mass. I've seen especially this one that almost horrified me, where there's communions being celebrated and presented. People are going down the aisles, narrow aisles, to receive communion. And there was someone who was a Eucharistic minister who had a tray of hosts and was going in the opposite direction. And I couldn't believe it when I seen it. There's a very narrow aisle. She was going up this narrow aisle against the flow of people coming towards her with this tray of hosts in her hand. And there was a lot of shimmying back and forth. People would stop, make sure they don't run into her, and vice versa. And it was taken to the back of the church. And I was looking at it thinking, what is she doing? What are they doing with these hosts in the back of the church? Well, they had this practice at this church where they would have a line of chairs along the back of the church. And I was thinking that, well, this line of chairs, it may be there for disabled people, but I didn't see any walkers. They did have pews in the front for the disabled that would facilitate them receiving communion. So they weren't disabled. These were people, because of the circumstances in their parking lot, they're trying to get out of the parking lot fast. They want to sit in the back of the church. And what they were doing here at this church, they were expediting communion. So instead of having these people come from the back, like everyone else in the pews, they were taking a tray. It's not funny, but it's just, I was actually horrified when I saw this. They were taking a tray of hosts around the back and passing it around like an hors d'oeuvre, just to expedite the Mass. So that was a bit of the final straw for me, and I decided, I can't participate in a Mass like that, a place like that which would mishandle the Eucharist in such a manner. And again, this person was in the back shimmying around people who were coming back to their seats, to their pews. And also around me, because at that point I'd left, I had to walk by that person who I think I was, you're not supposed to receive at Mass the feeling of horror. And I was actually horrified by the handling of the Eucharist. And there's a lot that can be done to help promote the real presence, the belief in the real presence in the church, just by making sure that we handle it reverently. So if the church is not handling the Eucharist reverently, why would you expect churchgoers to believe in it? Why would you expect any better from churchgoers when they go to a church where it appears that the church itself doesn't believe in the real presence? Also, I'd like to bring up the controversy around the traditional Mass, where the traditional Mass is being restricted. I went to this traditional Mass church, and it was one that I don't go to. I had to go to out of extraordinary circumstances. I could not attend the one I normally would attend. And I found out that this church, where they were providing a traditional Mass for many years, the bishop, the local bishop, decided that they could no longer use the church facilities. So they could not hold Mass. They could not hold Mass in the church. So they're relegated to having Mass in a basement where they had a makeshift altar. Again, this is the body and blood and soul of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that is a definite lack of respect that is being given to not just the churchgoers themselves and their beliefs, and forget about that, but respect that should be given to the Eucharist and the Mass itself that's being offered. In a way, I felt moved to tears over the circumstance. And it was the closest I felt to Catholics being in the catacombs. I actually felt like I'd rather have Mass with those people than any others because of their circumstances and literally a persecution that was being inflicted upon them. So I think that the church needs to pay more attention to the Eucharist, what its actions, what its decrees are doing to the belief of churchgoers regarding the real presence of the Eucharist, whether it is treating one Mass better than the other, whether it is mishandling the Eucharist, whether it is body posture during the Mass. All of that needs to be evaluated, as well as what's being taught in Catholic schools, in CCD, what's being discussed at the homilies. So during the homily, I'd rather hear about the Eucharist than the football game. There's much could be done by just sprinkling a few homilies, even every year, that talks about the Eucharist. Much could be achieved by just bringing up a few homilies about the Eucharist once a year. I think that would set many straight. Many are misled because they just don't understand the teaching. Well, I hope that you found these statistics and these questions, these surveys, interesting, if not very hopeful. And I'd like to thank you all for joining, and God bless.